So let's talk a little bit more about pidgins and creoles, and what's the difference and how they connect to dialects. So a pidgin comes along when there's two groups of people who speak two different languages but who need to interact with each other for a particular reason. In history, many times this came about when there were new sort of shipping routes and people were coming into contact with others for the first time. And so many times these groups would want to trade with each other or communicate for other purposes. And at that point, they didn't know each other's language. So what would happen is they would come up with a pidgin, which was a very simple form of communication, not yet a language. It was really made up of linguistic elements that were sort of very basic, such as maybe some words, sounds, a lot of body language, and these aspects were taken from the languages that these two groups spoke. Okay, and it wasn't systematic. It wasn't something that everybody had sort of established, like, you know, this object is going to be named this particular vocabulary word, right? It wasn't systematic in that way. It sort of developed very incrementally and was very basic at the beginning. However, as this interaction continued on and gained some time, there was a new generation that was born in that environment where these two groups of people were interacting. This is when the pidgin changes to a creole, because this new generation of children that are born into that environment, they're hearing that pidgin being spoken. As you know, human beings have the innate ability for language, right, and are able to learn about the system and the organization of the rules and the structure of language. And so these children, hearing the pidgin, actually began to internalize it and systematize it by adding rules. So this helped the pidgin get to the next stage of sort of language development, where it became more systematized and rule governed. So this new generation was adding rules, and now for the first time it actually becomes the mother tongue, the first language of this new generation, and in that way it's passed down to more generations. Okay, so a pidgin is different to a creole because a pidgin is not systematized, it's not the native language of anyone, and is very, very rudimentary. A creole is different because now that pidgin that has had more time, it's been exposed to a new generation of children who then systematize it by adding rules, and now that creole becomes the first language of that new generation and is passed down, right, and becomes sort of a new language, right? It's the beginning of a new language. So within a generation or two, the native language use becomes more consolidated, more widespread. At the beginning, it may be used only for trade, but then as it becomes rule-governed and systematized, it would eventually start to be used in other areas of life for other purposes, and so the vocabulary that's added to that language becomes more and more widespread, right? It sort of gains vocabulary and gains use. And this is the result. The result ends up being a creole or a creolized language. Okay. So let me give you an example of how this happened in the United States, okay, and how it is related to African American English vernacular. So here we have a map of some of the slave routes, the slave trade routes of ships that used to go between America and Africa. And the slave traders used to okay, so here we have a map of these Atlantic slave trade routes and the routes that the ships would take from from America to Africa and back. So many linguists trace the development of African American English vernacular or Ebonics back to the time of slavery and the slave trade. During the slave trade, ships collected slaves from several different nations rather than just trading with one nation. And here is actually the rationale from a slave trader as to why they would do that. So the rationale is that the safest way to trade with the different nations is to have some of every sort on board, and that way there will be no more likelihood of their succeeding in a plot. So they really thought that if they were going to get slaves from different areas in Africa, that would increase their chances that the slaves couldn't overpower them and take over. And so this is how they were strategic in trying to get around the possibility of taking over, because the people shared a language. So here we have a situation where we have like groups of language group A, language group B, language group C, D, E, F. So people from different areas who for the first time are meeting and are hearing different languages. And once they get to the United States, it's very important that the slaves were able to speak with their slave owners. And so they had to learn an English vocabulary, and this is where they established a pidgin language. So it was that rudimentary form of communication for the slave owners and the slaves, where they would have to talk to each other and communicate. As new generations of African English pidgin speakers were born, that pidgin became more systematized and became a Creole. And linguists who have studied that Creole have actually found that there's a lot of West African words, a lot of substitution of English words for West African words, but there is a lot of syntactical and morphological borrowings from the West African language patterns. Okay, but today African American English vernacular actually exists as a dialect, not as its own language. Okay, a Creole language would be its separate language to other languages. But today, African American English vernacular is a dialect. And if you think about why, we know that in the greater context of the United States, English is the dominant language. And so even though there may have been a Creole at some point, the aspects of the West African languages that would have been included would have faded, so that it mostly became English-based, so that it could be intelligible by others who spoke English as well. And so today, African American English vernacular actually exists as a dialect. But I do want to talk about the language of the Creole language of Gullah. So Gullah is actually a Creole language that is spoken in the United States around the South Carolina areas, and it's actually native to an island off of the South Carolinas that is called Gullah. Okay, and this was the Creole language, one of the Creole languages that was developed from this introduction of the two groups of people. And it's still spoken there today. Sadly, it is fading. There's not a lot of Gullah speakers, but Gullah is recognized as its own language, meaning that you cannot understand it. It's not mutually intelligible with English. Okay, so I'm going to play you a clip so that you can hear what that sounds like.
Children for join me one more again from this your Gullah Geechee Nation Wine on Nation News. This is a Queen Quet, the head from the body of this your Gullah Geechee Nation. And this your day, we did down yonder in what we call Savu. Some of our children call them Savannah, Georgia. And I know you other folks who don't speak our language call it Savannah, Georgia. This historic city. We are here at the port.
Okay, so you notice at the beginning she was speaking Gullah. You probably didn't understand, and that makes sense because it is a whole other language. And then at the end of that video, of that clip, she started speaking English, which you could understand. Okay, so that's just an example of a Creole language. And sometimes I get the question about how is a Creole language different to a language of itself. And the difference is sometimes, so a Creole language doesn't have the history that a language has associated with it. So a language usually has a long period of time where the language has had time to become established, where there's a literature connected to that language, people have written texts and things like that, and it's really situated in history with sort of a time period where it's had development. Okay, a Creole language really doesn't have that yet. It's at the end, sort of the early stages in terms of becoming a full-fledged language. I mean, it is systematized and rule-governed, and there are generations that do speak the Creole language, but it's missing sort of the key figures that help to establish its presence in literature and things like that. Also, I get the question about Haitian Creole. So Haitian Creole is a full-fledged language with its own history, and has had enough time in order to grow and sort of be situated as a full language. The fact that it's called a Haitian Creole is just a name, but it's a name that helps to remind us of its history. So Haitian Creole has a lot of influence from French, which was one of the main languages that were sort of infused together with some of the African languages in that island. So today it's called Haitian Creole language. It is a full-fledged language. It just is named today for its history as Haitian Creole. Okay, so now we're going to get into activity 2. And what I'd like you to do, you can find activity 2 in this unit where you're watching this video. And we're going to look at a Martin Lawrence show clip. And what I'd like you to do is try and look at the transcript, which I'm going to give you, and see if you can see any patterns around the phonology or the syntactical rules being demonstrated in that transcript. And the point is here to really see for yourselves that African American English vernacular is rule governed, is systematized, and actually functions by a lot of complex rules. Okay, that actually sometimes make much more sense than the rules that we have in Standard American English. So you want to read each sentence in African American English vernacular, read this translation in Standard American English. I've color coordinated some of the words to help you find the trends and patterns, and I've also given you a sheet where you can talk to me about what the blue words tell you, what the purple words tell you, and things like that. Try and come up with the phonological and syntactical rules for each pattern, and your transcript is going to look something like this. Okay, so I'll give you time right now. You can pause the video, try and look at these different colors, see what you notice about the phonology or the syntax, and try and come up with a rule for it. We'll continue in a second.